Welcome to EduRev.
Welcome students. I'm Clarice Pereira Colasso and I have been training NEET medical aspirants in botany and zoology as well as NCERT based board exams for the past 8 years. In the previous video lectures we have studied pre-fertilization structures and events of both the androecium and the gynoecium. We also studied a little bit about pollination. In today's class, we are going to look further into the pre-fertilization events. That is, we're going to look into the agents of pollination. So what are the different agents that help in pollination? Now, the different agents of pollination can actually be classified into two. That is the abiotic agents and biotic agents. Abiotic agents are actually of two different types. You can either have Anemophily, which implies wind pollination, or you can have Hydrophily, which clearly states water pollination. Biotic agents are generally, or rather they are animals generally speaking, and these particular biotic agents, they are of a variety of different types of animals that can help. Okay, but generally speaking we study about Entomophily and Ornithophily. Entomophily implying we are studying about insect pollination, which is the biggest help when we come to pollinating agents, so insects are the biggest help. And you have Ornithophily, which implies bird pollination. Now, one must not confuse between bird and bat pollination because remember, bats are mammals. So here we are very specifically referring to bird pollination. So let's start with the first type of pollinating agent, and that is the abiotic agent of wind. So none other than Anemophily. Now we need to understand what are the various characteristics of this particular flower. What does the androecium look like? What is the nature of the gynoecium? And what is the nature of the whole inflorescence and the entire flower structure as such? Now, since we're talking about wind pollination, we must understand that the anther must be projected outwards so that as wind blows, and if the anther has dehisced, the pollen can immediately be taken up with wind. So the first thing that we need to understand is that the androecium must be exposed. However, the pollen grain that it liberates must be light so that it can move easily with wind. And it must be non-sticky. Now it needs to be non-sticky for the simple reason, if it was sticky, if the anther has dehisced, the pollen grain will not be released out into wind. So non-sticky is very, very important. Smooth nature is important. Likewise, if we consider the gynoecium must be capable of catching or holding that particular pollen grain that's present in the air currents. So in a way, the gynoecium stigma must behave like a net, so it needs to be feathery and it needs to be exposed. So here also you will have an exposed and a feathery stigma. However, you will find that the ovary generally has the presence of a single ovule. Okay, single ovulated ovaries is what's present. But you will find numerous number of flowers present in the inflorescence, clusters of flowers. Now, considering it is a wind type of pollination and it is an abiotic factor, we do not require to provide, say, edible pollen, or we do not need to provide nectar to the pollinating agent. Also, it does not make much of a difference if the flowers are big or small. So generally speaking, the plant would not invest too much of its resources into forming big flowers. It finds that small flowers are more than enough. So you would find that the flowers are going to be really small and the petals are going to be dull in color because you do not need to attract the pollinating agent. Also, no nectaries, absence of nectar. Now here you can see wind pollination in case of Z maize, which is nothing but the corn or your maize. Okay. Now very clearly, I'm quite sure all of you have seen a corn cob. Now you'll find a number of tassels on top. Those tassels refer to, or they reflect the presence of the stigma and the style. So those long feathery things, those long parts are the style that remain, and obviously the cob is the fruit. Okay. Now considering that the cob has so many different seeds over there, it means that it was a clustered inflorescence. Now here you can also see Anemophily in case of grasses. Okay, so the anther dehiscing, giving out its pollen grain, carried by wind, and that side you can see the presence of a feathery stigma collecting that particular pollen grain. Now the next type of pollinating agent is Hydrophily or water pollination. Now, water pollination is not a very general type of pollination, not very commonly seen in higher plants. It is more frequently seen in case of lower plants. For example, algae present in water, you will have water pollination, hydrophily. Bryophytes, you will have hydrophily. Pteridophytes, now some of them will have hydrophily, not all of them. Okay, but the moment you come to the higher plants such as gymnosperm and angiosperm, hydrophily is not preferred. So therefore you will see in case of angiosperms, only around 30 genera of your monocots will have the presence of a hydrophily. So very few monocots will show it. You will not see it in case of dicots. Now, there are a couple of examples that you need to study which are really important for the NEET exam. The first is, what are the examples of hydrophily in fresh water? So you'll find hydrilla and you'll find balasinaria are two examples that you need to remember. And the marine form that you need to remember is Zostera. It's a type of seagrass. So these are important for you. Now let's study a little bit about hydrophily in case of balasinaria. Now, in this particular case, let's look at what is the position of the male inflorescence, the male flower. So the male flower seems to be submerged in water. But as the male flower develops, it breaks off from its original plant and it starts moving upward, okay, until it reaches the surface of water. So you'll find that the male flowers kind of reach the surface of water. Now, if you look at the structure of the male flower, you will find that the male flower has the presence of two anthers, one on each side. So you need to remember what the male inflorescence is like and what is the position of the male flower after it has become mature. Now let's look at the female flower. You see that the female flower looks to be as if it is also moving towards the surface. However, it's still attached to its parent plant. But if you look at the original female flower before it became mature, you'll find it's kind of coiled inward. So the moment it becomes mature, the coil kind of unwinds and the flower gets projected towards the water surface. So essentially speaking, in balasinaria, you can see the stigma is kind of on top, okay, on the water surface, and you can find that the male flower is floating on the water surface. Okay, so the female flower is partly submerged with just the stigma very close to the water surface. Now, this particular stigma causes depressions in the water around it, kind of like a whirlpool. Okay, and as the male flower is floating on that water, if it by chance enters into this particular depression caused by the stigma, it will tilt and fall into the stigma in a way. Since the stigma is going to be sticky, the anther, since it has already dehisced, the pollen grain will fall onto that particular stigma and pollination has occurred. Okay, so this is what happens in case of balasinaria. Now, in case of Zostera, Zostera is a marine plant. Now, what we need to remember is, in case of Zostera, you have the presence of a ribbon-shaped pollen grain. So here you have a figure that shows you, thin and slender, ribbon-shaped pollen grain that moves in water. Now, let's move on to the next type of pollinating agent, and those are entomophilous flowers. So entomophily, okay, nothing but insect pollination. Now, this is the major type of pollination over here. So we need to study what are the characteristics of the flowers involved. Now, since it is an insect pollination, it does not make too much of a difference if the androecium, if the anther is exposed or whether it is inside. It does not make too much of a difference. However, what is important is that the pollen grain is sticky. Now, why do you require pollen grain that's sticky? It needs to stick onto the body of the insect so that the insect can transfer that particular pollen. Now, sometimes that pollen is also edible, so that's a factor that attracts the insect towards that particular flower. So we need to remember this point. Exposed and or inward directed androecium does not make much of a difference. The second is the pollen grain needs to be sticky and it can be edible sometimes. The next is with respect to the gynoecium. Now, likewise, you do not require to have a gynoecium that's exposed. So it may be exposed or it may be inward directed. We're not very specific. But what we need to study is what is the nature of the flower here. Now, since you want to attract an insect, obviously the flowers have to be brightly colored so that the insect feels attracted. Also, you need to have the presence of nectar so that, if they do come, they have something to be attracted towards. So you will have the presence of nectar. And also another thing that can attract them is the presence of fragrance. So large bright petals in the flowers, fragrance, and you will have the presence of nectarine. So that means nectar is available. Now, let's look at ornithophily or bird pollination. Now, bird pollination, if you look at the flowers first of all are a little tubular. So if you look at the figure given to you, the flowers are a little bit tubular, okay? And when we talk about bird pollination, we are mainly referring to hummingbirds or sunbirds, okay? So they've got elongated beaks, so you need tubular flowers. Now, you will find that in these flowers, the flowers are much more brightly colored as compared to insect pollination. That's the first thing that you need to remember. Secondly, the amount of nectar that they will provide is also much more than what you will find in insect pollination. Now, why so? Obviously, a bird will draw in much more nectar than what an insect can draw in. Okay, so therefore, remember, bird pollination always has, or rather, bird pollinated flowers always have more amount of nectar as compared to insect pollinated flowers. And also, they are way more brightly colored as compared to insect pollinated flowers. Now, for an animal to come and pollinate, for an animal to move towards a flower, it must receive a reward from that particular flower or from that particular plant. Those are called as floral rewards. Now, floral rewards can be classified into three different entities. The first is because it provides food for the animal, food to that particular insect. Okay. Now, the food can be in the form of edible pollen, or the food can be in the form of nectar. This is very easy for us to understand. But the remaining two categories are what we need to focus on. Floral reward in terms of nursery providing, implying that the flower provides a place of nursery for the animal, for the young ones of the animal. And the next, sex providing. So we will try to understand these two concepts of nursery and sex providing floral rewards. Now, starting with nursery providing. The example that we're going to take is the case of fig and wasp. Now, fig and wasp have actually got a mutualistic relationship between them, this symbiotic. Okay. Now, let's look at the figure of what a fig flower looks like. Now, the fig flower actually has a hypanthodium type of inflorescence. So this is the inflorescence. You'll find the male flowers on top and you'll find the female flowers below. Now, when the wasp enters, so it enters through that hole on top. Okay. So when the wasp enters, it goes and lays its eggs very close to the female flower, so right down. Okay, goes and lays its eggs very close to a female flower. Now, why does the wasp enter in the first place? What are the advantages to the wasp? The first is ovipositioning. Now, ovipositioning means the laying of eggs. But the second advantage is, remember, after the female flower gets fertilized, we will come to the method of fertilization. So after the female flower gets fertilized, you're going to get a couple of seeds over there, quite a bit if you've eaten fig. Okay, so you get a lot of seeds in the fruit. Now the larvae start consuming a few of those seeds as they start developing. So when the eggs hatch and they start developing, they consume a few of those seeds and they start growing. Okay, so it provides nutrition for the larvae. These are the advantages to the wasp. Remember, symbiosis. Okay. But what is the advantage to the fig plant? The first is pollination is achieved. The question is, how is pollination really achieved? Now, on top you can see that's the entry and the exit point. So let us assume that the wasp has entered. It has gone towards the base where the female flowers are and it has laid her eggs. Now, as she is moving outward, she will have to cross the anthers of the male flower. As she crosses the anthers of the male flower, she will take some of that particular pollen. Let's say she visits another plant, another fig plant, to lay a couple of more eggs over there. Now when she does that, she will again be passing the male flower and then moving towards the female flower. So in that particular event, she will transfer pollen grain from the first flower to the female flower of the second plant. Okay? Now you may argue and say that the male flower is also present in the second plant, but the understanding is this: the anther and the stigma are not active, or they're not receptive at the same time. Okay, so because of this non-synchrony that takes place, this really helps in pollinating of the female flower. So pollination is the first thing that happens. The next advantage that you find here, seed dispersal. Now how so seed dispersal? Once the fruit is formed, and remember the larvae are down there, so obviously once the larvae start moving out, they take some of the seeds around with them. Okay, so therefore dispersal of seeds is also achieved by the wasp. So these are the advantages, and this is how nursery is provided by the fig to the wasp. The next, sex providing. Now the example of sex providing flowers, okay, is studied with using the Mediterranean orchid, that is Ophrys, and bees. Now if you look at the figure of the Mediterranean orchid, you will find that some of the petals, okay, of the Mediterranean orchid have got striations and have got colors that look like the bee. Now actually speaking, they resemble certain parts of a female bee. So a male bee tends to confuse these petals and think that these petals are the female, and therefore it approaches this particular flower and tries to copulate, tries to have intercourse with these particular petals. But understand that this is not the female, so it is a form of pseudo copulation, false copulation. And even so, when it does approach this flower, certain amount of pollen will get stuck onto its body. When it tries to enter into another orchid of another different plant and pseudocopulates on the other side as well, it will transfer that pollen from the first flower to to the stigma of the second flower. So in other words, cross-pollination is provided. Okay, but in a way, the Mediterranean orchid is actually conducting what we call a sexual deceit. It is a form of deceit towards the bee, because actually speaking, that's not the female. Now, so here we have the different floral rewards: food providing, nursery providing, and sex providing. So we need to understand that when we talk about nursery providing and sex providing, the flower or the plant and the corresponding insect or animal have undergone a process of co-evolution, which means a change in one will demand a change in the other. Otherwise, you will find that both of them will eventually get extinct. So let's go through a couple of MCQs. The first one: dash pollinated flowers must have bright colors and plenty of nectar and pollen. The first one is Ophiophily. Now, Ophiophily implies snake pollination. Okay. The next one, Characterophily, which implies bat pollination. Entomophily, insect pollination, and Ornithophily is bird pollination. Now, remember, between C and D, both of them require brightly colored flowers, lots of nectar and pollen. But between them, obviously, bird pollination demands much more. So the answer here is option D. Next, dash pollination is seen in case of Anemophilus. Now, Anemophilus has the presence of Entomophily. Okay, so the answer here is C. So let us continue with the next MCQ. Which of the following is when pollinated? Option A, coconut; B, calotropis; C, balsam; and D, plum. Now, amongst all of this, we must remember that coconut belongs to the category of grasses, and therefore the answer here is option A, and that is coconut. The fourth MCQ. The pollen grains of Anemophilus flowers are dash: A, smooth and dry; B, large and sticky; C, rough and sticky; and D, grouped in clusters. Now, obviously, it cannot be sticky in nature, since we're talking about wind pollination, and in wind pollination, it is essential that they are able to move away, separate from the dehisced anther. So option B and C are out of the question. Option D, grouped in clusters. Now, if you are grouped in clusters, that would make you heavy, and that would become difficult for wind pollination. Therefore, the answer in this particular case is option A. You need to be smooth, in other words, non-sticky, and you need to be dry, in other words, you are going to be light as well. Option 5, question number 5. Epihydrophily is observed in dash. Now, epihydrophily is a type of water pollination. Now, very clearly, wheat and yucca, that is option A and option D, are out of the question here. Okay, so we limit our answers to B, Zostera, and C, Vallisneria. Now, amongst these two, Zostera has hydrophily, but this hydrophily occurs within water and not on the surface of water. So the answer cannot be B. But if you remember what we have studied in Vallisneria, we have studied that pollination occurs on the surface of water. So the answer here is option C. So students, I invite you to go through EduRev Infinity for a whole lot of other test papers, other videos, and you will be able to understand a lot about different other topics which will help you prepare for your NEET exam. And I'm sure by doing so, you will achieve a very good nationwide ranking. Thank you.